Buonasera a tutti.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think that we may kickstart our second meeting of this cycle consecrated to the psychology of masses, 100 years after the publication of Freud's book. This series of gatherings organized by the Università Sapienza Department of Philosophy, the Institute for Psychoanalytical Studies, the IPRS. My name is Raffaele Bracalenti. I am the president of the IPRS. I would like to welcome all of you to this second webinar. We have the pleasure to have with us today Professor Romano Màdera, who will talk to us about pseudospeciation, from pseudospeciation to scapegoat. I'm not going to talk about the themes that is going to explore. I simply wanted to introduce him. Professor Màdera was ordinary professor of moral psychology, philosophy at the University of Milan, Bicocca. And currently, he's one of the founders, he was one of the founders of the open seminars of philosophical practices of the School of Philosophical Practices, Philo. He authored many publications. A recent publication was published by Claudiana, The Chaos of the World, The Chaos of Affectivity. He published that in 2020. And before giving him the floor, I would like to remind you that the next meeting, the third seminar, will be held on the 9th of April, again at 6 p.m. This time, we will have two American presenters, Ferdinando Castillon and Pong, with Sergio Benvenuto, who will be a discussant, and also Castillon, and also Colombiano. And Pong will be from the East. He is anyway an American. He's an hyphenated citizen, as the Americans said. Well, yes, he's a hyphened citizen. So the title of Castillon's presentation is "No Leaders, No Masses: Leadership in the Shadow of Freud." So neither leader, no masses. Life in masses. Well, Fong will talk about group life in the 21st century. So from a community of citizens to a network of users. Group life in the 21st century. I would also like to remind you that before the 9th of April, on the 26th at 6 p.m., there will be we will publish a new issue of Dromo. We will also have the possibility to talk about this issue. You can find on the website dromorivista.it. We will also have the possibility to talk about this issue that will be published. That is about the impact of COVID among healthcare personnel, and so this issue will also be devoted to mental health. I think that with this, I can leave the floor to Professor Màdera. I would first of all like to thank him for being with us today. We spoke earlier, and we had the possibility also to talk about different moments of the history of this country. I have to say, well, that we focus on the 1970s. Well, Professor, you have the floor. Well, first of all, thank you for your invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about the theme of masses and the relationship with individuals and the psyche, but I will start from very far. And I apologize for that, because probably I will be a bit boring, but the theme seems to have many gigantic implications that concern the nature itself of sociability, the capacity, the possibility of the human social nature and its various forms. We, of course, are reflecting on Freud's book of 1921. And masses also include the institutionally organized masses, like those that are analyzed by Freud, so churches and the army. So any consideration on this theme inevitably relies upon the sociability of human beings, because that is a structure, and it is, of course, my personal reflection, that as a structure in which it is possible to place the variations of the psychic variations of both the individual and of the families. Or at the same time, we might say, as Freud says, and as most psychoanalysts do, with just a few exceptions that were not really taken into consideration by the analytical world, like Adler, Rind, or Fromm. Well, anyway, social impulses, as Freud said, cannot be original, nor can it be further analyzed. He also said that at the onset of its formation, that is, the formation of social impulses, can be found in a more limited domain or realm, such as that of the family. So, if you do not agree, like me, with this, because this somehow isolates the forms of the family from the rest of the society, and I think that this is quite debatable from an anthropological, but also from historical standpoint, then we have to start from scratch before we can start talking about masses and also organized masses. Now, human sociability can be considered as a distinctive feature, well, of course, at least according to me, as an elementary distinguishing trait. What do I mean by elementary? Well, elementary to me means something that cannot be further reduced. It cannot be separated into smaller elements. So there are many authors that talked about this in various cultures and at various times of our histories. Of course, this doesn't say anything about its truth. However, I would say that we know that a human group, and even today, in the few realities that are on the margin of modern civilization, well, a human group that falls below a certain number of members is destined to disappear. And these members are much more than a single family. Of course, I'm talking about various forms of family. And the expulsion of an individual from a group For instance, a group of hunters or a group of a tribe of Indian Native Americans. Well, the expulsion was considered as a punishment, and it also entailed the danger of the threat of death, but also the exclusion from the society, the exclusion from the group. So I think that these are consequences of the fact that humans have developed a culture that differentiates them from any other culture, from the culture of any other animal species. Why? Well, they are differentiated because they are present in various niches of the planet, because they are also engaged in exchanges that involve groups that are not connected, that have no family connection. So that is why these networks are very broad. And also, humans can learn a lot in terms of socially necessary elements, including languages. So this number of things that humans learn is fundamental in order to be part of the group. So what is necessary is a long training so that we can fully participate in the life of a group. And this process is made possible by the neothenic characteristics of the newly born that So, and these features are kept by the newly born for quite a longer period, longer than other species of mammals or the primates as well. So, all in all, now this phase is protracted longer so that the human cubs manage not to depend from the group, from the family. So which means that being born biologically is something that is remodeled and reshaped by the cultural education. So in order to preserve biological life, a human being needs to be acknowledged or recognized. I think that in sociability, one of the main issues, if not the main issue, is the recognition, the acknowledgement. And that also triggers this pseudospeciation. Moreover, what distinguishes us from other species is the cultural evolution, the general cultural evolution, which make more and more complex tools, objects, and practices. And also, we choose the best innovations to pass them on to the newer generations. These processes would be impossible without the invention of social institutions, because only social institutions can stabilize these mutual networks. I mean, we always have these networks given the sociability, the group that goes, beyond the family group and so on. However, these mutual networks, these networks of mutual action have to be stabilized into norms that are collectively recognized. And these are sources of various forms of sanctions which go as far as the expulsion from the group. I think that it is not possible to see these characteristics, these features, if we do not attribute them to a set of skills and motivations that are specific for cooperation. So this is another key term, the recognition, the acknowledgement, the non-recognition, pseudo-speciation. We'll see what it is later. And here we also have the species-specific motivations that are fundamental for cooperation, because from what I said so far, you may fully understand that all of these ideas can be articulated around motivations and skills to cooperate. In fact, the human beings are characterized by the fact that they build worlds of common engagements, of common commitment, because thanks to their ability to cooperate, and their ability to cooperate generates these common commitments. And as I said earlier, this is part of the cumulative culture of practices and artifacts, and it also leads to social learnings, language, up to the institutions. Many philosophers, modern philosophers, for instance, John Searle and Bradman, also talk about shared intentionality. But we may also find the genealogy of this idea in European culture in Plato, or also Aristotle, Vico, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, and others, George Herbert Mead, Arnold Gehlen, to mention just a few, I mean, at least the authors that I'm more familiar with. So, attention and mutual recognition are the ways in which we can share and support one another. So learning, so the education that helps us become a human is not only something that we do or learn by imitation, even though imitation is the primary process involved in this, but it all depends on mutual learning, mutual teaching, which goes beyond the family. Imitation also helps us become similar to the others who form the group, as if this was an end in itself, that is to assert the group's identity, impose rules, and avoid or punish those who threaten the unity of the group. Now, the mechanism of pseudospeciation establishes and also strengthens the group's unity, and also it leads the destructive aggression against the external enemies. So pseudospeciation, that we will go back to that, pseudospeciation means to create a species which is not another species, but it is a pseudo-species, so the other human who's not seen as human, but as a sort of monster or another possible prey that needs to be conquered or someone to be excluded and so on. So the dynamic to create scapegoats is functional to this mechanism, and it will serve as the synthesis of both dimensions, because the scapegoat acts as a possibility to express this destructive aggression against the enemy that becomes a different species through pseudospeciation, and this also entails a stronger identity for the group. So what is a pseudospeciation? So we may say it is the tendency to strengthen and to turn into a norm a difference that is produced by the need to maintain the group's human unity, to adapt oneself so that the group can adapt to different spaces, because of course, I'm talking only about sapiens, and therefore we generate divergent cultural niches, because we have different realities wherever we live. And the group's unity, the group involves several families, also involves the development and the defense of a sense of mutual belonging, of membership. So this form of group identity tends to preserve the inner link, the inner bond, and to defend from the fear of the foreigners. And therefore, we limit our exchanges with them. And in case of violent clashes, they the foreigners are transformed into into people that belong to different species. Well, of course, I cannot speak too much about that. I will need to, I need to be brief on this because I do not have enough time. Anyway, the fact of being able to transform those who belong to our species into members of another species imply the fact that the natural inhibitions that exist also in humans can be triggered because we trigger our willingness to destroy our co-specifics. This means that this, let's say, destructive approach is also present in the primates or other species, but they're not as frequent as in our species. They're only present in certain cases, and they also happen by exception, because otherwise there are mechanisms that inhibit that. A classic is that among wolves, for instance, at times wolves may kill another wolf, especially belonging to other groups, but under some specific conditions, because normally instead there are some rituals, the rituals of aggressivity, for instance. So those who let's say, show that they are conquered, they're not killed. Whereas in human culture, this has become natural.
Allora, bisogna superare queste naturali inibizioni. Tecniche di ogni tipo sostengono questo passaggio, dalla mostrificazione alla alterazione attraverso riti e sostanze della percezione del nemico. Tecniche presenti in ogni cultura e società, anche nelle nostre. Per esempio, questo è qualcosa di documentato nelle guerre della ex Jugoslavia, con mezzi molto rudimentali, cioè ancora quello della prima guerra, della seconda guerra mondiale, l'alcol, ogni tanto la cocaina, fino ai Top Gun.
Sometimes up to the Top Gun, which is even more interesting. Of course, this is not always true. Anyway, we have grounded reasons to state that some groups of Top Gun in the US during the Middle East wars had to alter their state of perception to do what to do. This is very interesting because, as you know, Top Guns do not see any human being, but simply some crosses. But the fact that they know that these crosses might also indicate human beings, this is going to generate some problems, but we can go on. There is a whole history of popular demonstrations at the end of the 90s, the beginning of the 20s, where women and children are put at the forefront to strengthen the inhibition to shoot these people. Maybe they should shot the same, but they were forced to do that sometimes. So it's not by chance that Coral Lawrence thought that fire guns, due to the length, the range of shooting, have increased drastically the availability to war. So social cohesion is threatened for a bigger goal or evil. It's treated the same way. So pseudo-speciation works in the actual or potential crisis through this mechanism of the scapegoat, both individual and collective. So I've started from far behind. And I'm wondering what's the relation of all these general remarks with the topic, the problem of mass behaviors in relation to individual psychological dynamics. The social group, the crowd, the people, organized masses, institutions, social group, crowd, organized masses, institutions, to me, represent different tiers of dynamics and creation of a group identity. So there's also a culture of diversification compared to for everything that is foreign. So I would talk about a altruistic cooperation dynamic that is based on the mutual recognition of a common belonging that is counterposed to the extremission based on the lack of knowledge of the internal and external enemy. These are clashing and complementary strengths. Recognition and misrecognition are two opposites. The first is needed to keep and consolidate, and there are different forms of dehumanizing misrecognition, denial, annihilation of the foreign enemy by violating the enemy physically, or distancing, exclusion from participation to rights, margination and social exclusion, oppression, and the lack of recognition of the values and beliefs of those who is considered to be not recognized. So many things and outstanding remarks have been written by Honnet in a specific essay dedicated to misrecognition. Not all these forms, but at least some of this. So in this conflict between recognition and misrecognition, there is the group identity formation in its different social forms, stabilizing mutual trends and behaviors, cooperation, subdivision of work, institutions, the different forms of family. So all these entities create a context in which we can locate group identification. But this process, to me, doesn't need hypotheses that should search for an energetic or psychological ground. It's a social dimension. George Albert Bidin demonstrated how the formation of the self can be understood through social relations and the forms of game and language. Arno Gannett developed, based on this thought, the theory of action that from the first forms of perception, imagination, sensorial movements goes back to search for the language roots and then arrives at the most complex forms of participation and cooperation. The theory of charisma as one of the forms of power appeared in 1919 at the conference of Max Weber, Politics as a Profession. So we can, to me, we have to move away from this kind of social pulse. So the crowds convene in a temporary unity. And so these crowds can be interpreted as temporary phenomena that can fade away once the goal of this union has been achieved, or if there is an opposite and stronger reactions by the institutions. So in any case, also in the phenomenon of crowds, we can establish a certain threshold, a warning, an alarm signal that for some reason or another, some aspects of the social habits is disrupted by a moment of crisis. So we could think the phenomenon of a spontaneous forming of a crowd as a symptom that the recognition and misrecognition processes of the identity are somehow hindered, whatever the aggregation potential. And so it's completely different compared to the phenomenon of masses that have been convened or summoned by the institution or are mobilizing against some enemies. So these masses summoned by some institutions led us to think that the function of the leader is usually exactly one of the functional operations that are set by the institutions. The repetition of the ritual of the settling in of a leader confirms that it's not the leader who has a connection with the masses. It's the other way around. It's the institutions that recreate ritual, symbols, and myths of recurrent function of the charism of the leader. So it's social conditions and also including emotions and collective feelings that do create the leader and not the other way around. Or to make a distinction between two kinds of charism, a second level charism reproduces in an efficient memory the very basic charism that led to the need of reassessment, resettling of the different forces. So this charism is the expression of a complex mechanism, but to me, no charism can be a grounding charism if you do not make a progress in quality. So paradoxically, the charism of the leader can be creating something only when it disappears, and it leaves an heritage of procedures that can do without the previous guidance. Instead, when Freud refers to the Catholic Church as an Austrian, he had a certain kind of church as a reference, and it would be more difficult to apply his theory to the highly diversified and conflictual panorama of Protestant churches. Anyway, to me, the historic Christianity could be interpreted with a different reading of the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. This could be a typical example of how the grounding leader disappears. So not only dying on the cross, but with the in the John Gospel, that's the Spirit that is going to learn to teach the truth through the ascension in heaven. So it's the rest of Israel, the new church, as it is known in the Bible, is going to fulfill the universal mission. So Christianity itself shows that it's the leader who disappears, and by disappearing can create, to the benefit of the spirit, the creation of an institution that is guided by the collective entity that can keep on through the Pentecost, creating and following these dynamics. So this is a general rule of the social identity, is the charismatic movement that can become also either a legal constitutional power or would disappear, as Weber said. So for these reasons, organized masses, to me, simply refers to different events in the institutions. So Freud's cases are institutional par excellence, and the Catholic Church and the armies is an example of that. So unlike what we can infer from this kind of approach, these are examples of the subordination of charism to the bureaucratic rational continuity, a legal continuity, if we want. So how can we explain this long-lasting continuity of the Catholic Church over different millennia, or Orthodox Church, that would depend on the political situations in the different countries, if we do not think that this is the underpinning phenomena is this poverty and these movements of different hierarchical organizations, and then the legal and bureaucratic part. So that's what keeps the church united through the different popes. So charism is no longer there, that the leaders are no longer there, but the institution formally remains. It's like talking about the armies, postulating that their connections is in the ideal identification with the leaders. And then more specifically, the Prussian, the German one, when Freud wrote, that went through a terrible defeat, an army without any kind of charism, but this was strong enough to bloodily repress any attempt of revolution, forging agreement with paramilitary institutions, the Spartaco League, the Rosa Luxemburg examples, and both Le Bon and Freud seem particularly concerned of these revolutionary masses. Le Bon, the French revolutionaries, and Freud, the socialist ones. Well, for the sake of time, I cannot go in depth. This was just a very brief overview, just a short list of examples of how the word mass is used in three different speeches, so where there is a verbal emotion, in three speeches that have been extremely meaningful of Rosa Luxemburg in history, to show that there are different kinds of masses, different kinds of leaders, different emotions, affections, or intelligences. So, but going beyond polemics, I think that in a secondary way, Freud's message goes back to the basic group identity mechanism that is produced through pseudo-specification, so by creating the enemy and the scapegoat. So by demonizing everything that can obstacle the desires of peoples and groups. So let's go. How much time do you have? 10 minutes left. Thank you. So I can stick to my time. So populism, of course, we have to make a big jump and go up to today, otherwise this will be disconnected. Reactionary populism that is based on the EU and US model is both referring to a very high level of institutionalization and parties who are responsible to the government or to represent the organized forces of the opposition, and is mobilizing masses by exploiting a more or less spontaneous pulse. So we have to look at this populism in the category of reaction. Reaction to what? A reaction to the big regression. Reaction to a historical time that has generated nothing new, that can divert the forces and cannot go back. So what Gramsci said, it's an old thesis. We cannot revolve, and at the same time, it cannot produce anything new. So it's a crisis, a deadlock, and a regression situation. In the decades after the Second World War, there is something that is not questionable. The gap between rich national states is reducing up to the 70s, and the old colonialism disappeared. National liberation movements, movements to criticize the old regime created a new horizon of hope that was probably an illusion. But this progressive wave did not have the right strength, and today it's still the same, to become dominant. And the old system cannot restore itself through the global capitalism. So the form of the state nation is into a vertical crisis. So the favorable relations of force, like the state working conditions in the crisis of the 70s, were completely overturned, and the overall situation generated a chaotic moment in history. And I have to go back to the studies and a book that's been written both in English and Italian, because it was originally written in English by Giovanni Arrighi and Beverly, on chaos and governance in the world. It dates back to 15 years ago. So different forms of chaos. And also in my there is a summary in one of my new books that was mentioned by Bracalenti a few minutes ago. So important parts of work and subordinate work are seeking for a protection through politics that criticize the old values, but also the bourgeoisie is the middle class is intended as an enemy. But it's a protest that looks back at the past that cannot come back. And in the short run, in a 10-year time, we have been witnessing to a complete overturn of the popular consensus. The more we are away from the big cities that are considered innovative, the more we tend to preserving the status quo. This is happening in the US, in UK, Great Britain, and Europe as well. So the global frame is impacted by the loss of reliability of the industrial world and the environment problems, and also a big shift, and this is the biggest news in 4 centuries and a half, this shifting of the axis of the world power that was focused in the US, in Europe and then in the US. It's evident that in the competition for the world hegemony, the new challenge is the Chinese one, that and more enlarge the Asiatic sub-oriental area. This is leading to huge cultural problems that are not avoidable, and collective psychological crisis also in the management of the pandemics. So it's self-evident that we are going through a big crisis. I don't think that we can do without framing these contemporary mass movements outside of this framework. And increasingly, the identification mechanisms with a leading role do play a role as a secondary support. And this would deserve saying that everything that Freud said was right, but a different interpretation is supporting its secondary role. So if we look at a global vision, and there have been wonderful pages in history and in society that are still valid today, as also Jung stated, talking about a scapegoat in the Red Book, and there is a Neumann, a scholar of Jung, who's not saying the same things, but it's almost the same. He's one of the few psychologists who can talk about the societal histories. In the New Attic and Psychology of the Death, he states a theory of the scapegoat related to social forms, the denial, removal mechanisms that are quite important to me. But all in all, with the exception of certain hints to other authors I've been referring to, I would say that all in all, this is the way it is, that all these phenomena can be considered as a secondary support in the human sciences to explain certain identification mechanisms. If we look at the whole picture as a system, and then we start from there to try and understand the specific relations among organizations and masses, it's clear that leaders, for how strong they can be, they are a dependent variable in the system. In the recent history of Europe, US, and China, I think that there is a confirmation of this. The lack of big leaders today, being it positive or negative, is self-evident. We are lacking new leaders. But if we raise our gaze and we do not bend to the false necessity that makes this historic contingency eternal, in this time, in the current historical time, with the global capitalism as absolutely denied those conditions that were needed to let the group mechanisms of pseudo-speciation survive. Historical capitalism made this transition between the local interdependence to global interdependency. So humankind as a universal entity moved from the abstraction of a project or an idea to the concreteness of a universal that became the world. And this universal scope is the reality of economic interdependence and cultural interdependence up to the industrial capitalism revolution. Innovation was subordinated to tradition and complied with the subdivision of social work techniques, did not overcome a level that I called local interdependence. With the onset of global capitalism, the interdependence of everyone from anything and everyone, sorry, you have to draw your conclusions. Yes, so even though we are still far from this awareness of collective interdependence, and it has not been deeply rooted into collective awareness. Nevertheless, this interdependence is the basic condition of every kind of social work techniques, as well as the markets of goods and services. Politics itself depends on the global trend.
Che ha fatto per la prima volta il suo ingresso nella storia degli umani, produca continui salti in avanti e capriole all'indietro, è solo l'ovvia conseguenza del movimento di fondo. Dai fondamentalismi ai sovranismi, il movimento è in pieno sviluppo, ma ogni sua vittoria sarà parziale, locale, effimera e veemenziale. La rotta non è reversibile. Il capitalismo globale è l'inevitabile sbocco della storia del capitalismo e della sua vittoria. Lo spirito di utopia però vede attraverso le involuzioni, le resistenze, i conflitti e ne intuisce la possibilità di risoluzione nel riconoscimento collettivo, basato questa volta sul possibile patto globale di equilibrio e di pace e sull'autorealizzazione solidale degli individui. Autorizzazione solidale, non costrizione collettiva.
It is of course not this is a utopia, of course. And I say that it is only for 35,000 after Christ. So this means that we do not have, that all of this is not put at the service of the current economy. So the social identities will become more and more dysfunctional in the new reality of the inter and intradependence, interdependence, which is a new word that I myself created, which shows that interdependence does not simply concern material, productive, and institutional reality, but it will form into this new planetary interculture. Also the relationship between the leaders and the masses in this utopian perspective can become a long trait of the history of the past. Thank you, Professor. I would like to apologize to Franco, Lolli and Luciano Fiore because I had apologized. I have to apologize to them because I had forgotten a few details. So we today have Professor Màdera, but then we will have and the discussants, to whom I will now give the floor, Luciano Di Fiore, who, in fact, quite recently we presented his latest book here, Fantasmi del Desiderio, and Franco Lolli, a member of Alipsit, and we presented also very recently his latest book, Attività della Psicanalisi. So I apologize for not introducing you earlier because, you know, we talked about the past earlier, all the memories, and I also forgot to Professor Màdera is also Jungian psychoanalyst, as you might have understood, because he mentioned Jung, the Red Book, and he also authored, I think, a book about Jung. So I had apologized to say these things, so I really apologize. Well, apart from what you said about this utopia, I was wondering, well, of course, if we have the time, I would like to ask something, because I think that according to Professor Màdera, the monstrification of the enemy is more important than the idealization of the leader. Yes, exactly. And I think that this dimension of pseudospeciation is a specific dimension, not the idealization of the leader. And another thing that I wanted to know is, because I mean, the theme of pseudospeciation is so interesting to me. And apart from war phenomena, most of killings happen within families, as also Greek mythology teaches us. So this sort of war between parents and children, in the couples. So I wanted to ask, is this coherent, consistent with pseudospeciation? But then we'll probably have the time to talk about it later. I would now like to leave the floor to Luciano Di Fiore, and I hope he felt not insulted, you know, because I forgot to introduce him. So Luciano, you have the floor.
Grazie a tutti.
Thank you. I will start from where Professor Màdera left off, from global capitalism, and I will try to talk about the present time after rereading for the upteenth time this very interesting text by Freud. Yesterday, I read an interview to Thomas Piketty in which the French economist said that if we wanted to take the control over the capital, we have to stake everything on democracy. And the problem is that this is a major problem. It is really a major problem. Democracy has to be kept alive outside from that state of palliation to which it was reduced. Palliative democracy is what Pyeong-chul says in his latest book. Today, the crisis of democracy and the crisis within democracy are manifested in so many ways that it is very difficult to remember them all. We have the mistrust in politicians that undermine the legitimacy itself of democracy, the lack of efficiency. Or, for instance, look at this grotesque event, the vaccination in Europe, and also the lack of guidance. And so we talk about capitalism of surveillance. Privacy is not taken away from a regime like in 1984, but we give it up voluntarily in exchange for emails or the possibility to have a chat on Facebook, or in a clubhouse room. However, I cannot recall who said that even though it doesn't who said that if we believe that someone is not selling to us something, it means that we are the commodity being sold. So you see, there are many difficulties that the social bonds are experiencing. Social bonds need democracy. It is not the first time in modern times that these things are happening. Just to tell you that 4 years before Freud published the Massenpsychologie, someone who is very dear to all of us, a professor also like Antonio Gramsci, talked against the indifference of the masses. And he said that we all have to take part to participate. Gramsci said that masses let things become mingled in the name of fatalism and discouragement. And what happens is that only very few hands rebuild the life of collective life, while the masses are totally indifferent. So people give up their will, their power, their control, and put them in the hands of few people. Now, I think that the text by Freud somehow responds also to Gramsci, and it does so highlighting a specific aspect. It is not possible to enter the society to do politics only focusing on horizontal bonds. So it is clear that this is something that was also present 100 years ago. Of course, the context is different, the tools of surveillance, of control are different, but the point is the same. The social decline of the fatherly image contributes to undermine institutions. On nearly all these organizations, churches, trade unions, associations, they have suffered for a long time from a terrible crisis that has made them lose their symbolism. Well, some people are happy of that because, you see, this is seen as a proof that our society is post-ideological, secularized, so they are happy of the fact that people vote for a party and a couple of years later they vote for that party's opponent, or also that can also explain why many politicians feel authorized to change their majority without any control, without being answerable to the people that elected them. Why? Well, because this is one of the axioms of postmodernity. We do not propose, any political alternative. Any party and organization is only slightly different from the other political parties or organizations, and we somehow mitigate all the various programs that organization or political party has. So all the political parties want to support the workers, all political parties are in favor of industrial development as long as it is sustainable. All the political parties are in favor of the environmental protection, so they are all compatible and they are interchangeable, and therefore even if the party at government the parties at government change, well, their policies are the same. It doesn't matter. It's like, putting 1 or 2 spoons of sugar in your coffee. You do not really feel the difference. Also, nobody really knows what the Democratic Party is. Now, we hope that Enrico Letta will know what it is. I do not know why he accepted to run as candidate of the political party. Anyway, it is a party that seems to be ashamed of supporting a specific social group. It is ashamed of supporting specific interests. So they decide to sit in the middle to ensure governability, trying to avoid, to propose a vision of the world that implies a clear-cut vision. For instance, minimum wages, or should it be offered to people or not? Today, political parties choose the maximum possible inclusivity, and then by trying to meet everybody's needs, they will not satisfy anyone. So this is exactly the opposite of what Gramsci wanted when he wrote the Città Futura. So we have a party here that doesn't even want to give itself a political leader. And Freud writes, a leader in the place of the ideal place of the ego. A leader is such because it provides the ego that identifies with it what the ego needs, and in this way he remedies his anguish, his anxiety, So we might even say that this, which remains a form of post-ideological totalitarianism, is not a vision of the world, but rather it is the loss of any possible ideological vision of the world. However, I think that this nihilism, which I would define secondary nihilism, is also ideological. I think that it is part of the mainstream ideology of modernity. It is that ideology that for the past 40 years has continued to glorify the sovereignty of the individual, while the masses seem to have disappeared from the stage of history. And they become protagonists only as consumers. Now they are no longer protagonists because of COVID. You cannot even go out, and you cannot even go to shopping malls and therefore aggregate. At the same time, the sense of history itself has declined, and so that is why I was talking about these horizontal bonds, because we identify with our peers, but we have totally lost the vertical bond. What Bruno Boroncini said when he participated in the previous seminar, when he said that we inherited that from the father figure, and in this way we lose the guidance that may come from the father for the ego. So I am not really so optimistic as Professor Màdera, I have to say. I envy him, his optimism, I have to say. And I also agree with Freud in saying that the Aristotelic definition of the man also was too optimistic. A Western man is confirming himself as an animal that needs to be in a group. And in order to develop his individuality, of course, he needs to be seen by the other, but also he needs to consider the sentiment of the various groups of which he belongs. Some believe that well, Freud believed that this is a disease. Well, of course, we also have the classical models of association, and that have become stuck to stable. And I am not convinced of that. Davide Caricon, in the introduction to his now the edition of the book that we're analyzing, well, I would say that the people is dying. The people are dying, but not because of the crisis of the institutions. Rather, these latter, they are in decline because of the subjectivity that seems to have renounced, given up the unconscious, and this society doesn't even know that it has given up the unconscious. So 100 years of reflections on Freud's book taught us that a society without a fatherless society is probably impossible, and it is not simply a dream to dream. But when it becomes so, it brings with it a deep anguish. Raffaele, you see, I was within my 20 minutes. You were very, very good. And I would say that anyone who would like to make comments or also ask questions, you can use the chat. Now, before giving the floor to Franco Lolli, Luciano, I would like to say something, which is my fixation, I know. But you know that I would like to say something. In Italy, the jus soli exists even if it is bad. I mean, as the young people do not know, the young people, the minors who are born in Italy to foreign families, and who they can go to the Census Bureau and they can obtain the Italian citizenship. It is very bad. I mean, it is a law that requires too much time because I have to turn 18, but this exists. I do not understand why our politicians continue to argue about introducing the jus soli, which is already a law of the Italian Republic. I have to say that. But this, I think that we can say, let us change this horrible jus soli in its form, in its current form, in order to open it up more. But this is something that I really wanted to highlight. Then I wanted to make an example, a comment. You said, rightly so, that we no longer can stand conflicts. But I have to say, well, that right-wing movements, they are conflictual and they really want to engage in conflicts. I think that Trump and Trumpism, they managed to really stand the conflictuality. They managed to break the rules. They managed to also say things which were not appreciated, which were not supported. And I have to say that probably this is something that concerns left parties more than right parties. Earlier, we were talking about the 1970s, and now the left movements have become gentrified. So, you know, of course, if you and another thing that I wanted to ask, and I would like to ask that to Professor Màdera, because I think that what Luciano was saying is that in Italy, probably there is a huge decline in the political parties, but I'm not sure whether, Professor Màdera, is this happening? Because, I mean, as we live in the globalization, it is clear that certain things, vertical but local events or realities like political parties, they lose any meaning. So I wanted to understand whether you also talked about this globalizing aspect, which can also explain, let's say, these territorial aggregations. I do not know. Then we'll see if you have the time to respond to me. Franco Lolli, a member of Alite.
Trovo una provocazione in un certo senso.
This is a sort of provocation. What do you think? You have the floor, Franco. Thank you, Raffaele. Can you hear me all? Very well. So first, thank you for inviting me to this series of meetings that is very important. So as a preliminary introduction to my intervention, I think it's important to distinguish between mass and institution, because otherwise we confuse the two issues. Institution absorbs the phenomenon of a mass, it organizes that, puts it in the juridical, political, economic form. It's denaturing its originary feature. That's what Freud says, and to me, it's the biggest contribution of Freud in the text we are assessing right now. So my intervention is reasoning only in the moment of forming the mass, before it is institutionally organized, before it becomes an army or a church. So, more specifically, the phenomenon of a mass in connection with the leader. So I like to start this intervention by quoting Freud, as Luciano already did, and I'm really pleased that he quoted that, because to me, it's a quotation that stands for one of the strongest and disrupting theses. We want to rectify the statement of Trotter that man is an animal that lives together with other animals. It instead lives in a horde. It belongs to a horde guided by a supreme leader. So I think that with this very strict sentence, he dismantles the previous view on the existence of a Gregory thrust to aggregation in the human being, that through the being together of the unions would lead to the possibility to reach completeness. Freud says that this tendency is conceived only as an identification, connection with peers, and this is made possible, and that's very important in the reasoning of Freud. It depends on the fact that the individual is reliant to the willingness of the leader, accepts its domination and submits voluntarily to this leader. So what connects the human beings is not the spontaneous tendency and search for a bond of mutual assistance and solidarity. Freud said it's the need to rely on an owner, to love and to be loved. So the condivision of this object of love, the leader, would then create this peer-to-peer relation. So in this regard, this Gregory pulse is not original, it's secondary, and depends on the fact that they all share the same object of love. It's a Führer anyway, it's a despot. So the conclusion is, as said, a man lives as a horde animal, needs to be dominated from above, from the leader, the owner. So this idea rectifies Freud's idea in Totem and Taboo. Killing the primordial father does not sign the overcoming of this social organization. It leaves a memory, a nostalgic memory behind. The aspiration to go back to be submitted to the superior power has never been completely reabsorbed. So I would like to make some rapid considerations. I believe that the pseudo-speciation phenomena we have been analyzing can be understood, also inserted in this logic. The misrecognition is based on the fact that the individual, to belong to the mass, renounces to his ideal and assumes the collective ideal that specifically, as the professor said, is considering humans other human beings. So the adhesion to this new ideal that is imposed by the leader is the condition to be fully entitled to be part of the mass. So in this regard, the mass needs a sort of subjective diminutio intellectiva, a diminishing of the intellectual capacities of criticism by the individuals. The ideal of the leader then can be affirmed as a collective, unquestionable program that requires from each and every individual the contribution to be finally fulfilled. Any new ideals sustained by the power, the leader can be imposed. Also by monstrifying the enemy to aggress the enemy in different ways. So how can a new ideal be imposed with such a strength? How can the individual abdicate his judicial faculties and blindly rely to the whims of a tyrann? I think that this is the Freud's question. So I think that we have to resort to another important remark by Freud, describing the qualities of the leader. So to me, it's very important. He says, the leader to impose himself and his new ideal to which the mass will comply needs two features. It must show up to having a stronger force, but also must have a higher libidic freedom. And that's the extraordinary breakthrough of Freud. What does it mean? This is not explained by Freud, so I cannot tell precisely. This libidinal freedom, so the leader to be such, to be recognized as a leader, shall have a certain relation with enjoyment, shall show having a certain easiness, competence, and access, a special access to pulse satisfaction. So this is important to be specified because it's not knowledge that the quality that characterizes the leader, not knowledge as we intend that. The mass, the primary mass, so not the institutions, is attracted by this libidinal freedom of the leader. The leader, so to say, is the person who can manage enjoyment or shows having this capability. The leader of the mass that can generate the primary mass phenomenon is a pulsional being charged by these pulses. And so this can be interpreted in two ways. First, stability. The leader is the one who can manage pulses, how to satisfy himself, and at least shows up being capable of managing enjoyment. This is the assumption of knowledge that fascinates the mass. How to satisfy a pulse. He is capable of dominating these pulses, not being dependent from this, instead to leverage these pulses to his benefit. It's not only a sexual pulse, it's not overlapping completely, even though sexual component is not secondary at all. The leader can embody the sexual object. The study was performed on the body of the leader, but it's not the level we have to say to Freudian pulse. As Lacan says, pulse is a special relation of the subject with the demand, the way in which a subject is positioned compared to another. The choice of the elective object of pulse for Lacan is a significant determinant in the relation between one human being and another. It's the prevalence of a certain kind of oral anal satisfaction that is materialized in a certain way in which the subject, the individual relates to the world, and then would be the style of this person. So the pulse, the way in which it is satisfied, qualifies the individual. Therefore, a certain libidinal freedom, as Freud says, sort of being capable of managing these pulses, does exert a power of fascination, the capacity to satisfy oneself, which is usually a very problematic situation. We admire in the leader this power. We would like to emulate it And so the more this quality of the leader is fascinating, the more this power is deeply manifested, the more its profound root emerge. So we reach the second aspect that is usually shadowed a little bit. We said that what is fascinating in a leader is the capacity to manage pulses. This capability is even more fascinating the more it is also underpinned by the pulse of death. That's the regressive thrust that animates every pulse. What do I mean with this? The fascinating, charismatic power of the leader is proportional to its capacity to embody the ambivalence of pulse. And on one hand, ensures an unprecedented satisfaction, and on the other hand, it's accompanied with the eclipse of the self, its temporary dissolution, death. So the satisfying a pulse is not satisfying the self. Lacan said, s'enjouir. This means expressing the personality of the pulsional satisfaction. It's a satisfaction of something that is claimed by the individual, but does not coincide with the experience of pleasure. The concept of enjoyment by Lacan states this ambivalence of pulse satisfaction. It's a libidinal discharge that activates and revives the system. It then condemned the pulse to repetition, but it's also the dissolution of the self, the experience of losing control, the capacity to deal with a void of thought in which the bodily phenomena prevail, where there is enjoyment, the absolutism of enjoyment. Lacan talks about this in Seminar 16. The enjoyment is absolute, dissolved from any sensorial relation. It's the setting that hypnotizes the neurotic, enchanted by the self-affirmation of what he observes or thinks to observe in the leader. So the leader, in this perspective, the fascination comes from this satisfaction, this libidinal mask that can even be a projection of sexual sensation. The body is a place of satisfaction and so desirable, but beware that this power is based on the absolutism and the pulse of death that surfaces in any manifestation of energy and generation. The rhetoric of generative vitalism, the birth and the development of the different myths of politicians or psychoanalysts or clerical persons that then found churches or parties based on their names and impersonation of commitment. There is the deepest pulsional enjoyment, the nihilistic and destructive pulse that is exactly what enchants the neurotic. So, and it's also perverse and masochistic. So putting oneself in the hands of a leader, relying totally to a leader, means all in all being the object of his narcissistic self-affirmation enjoyment, thus satisfying one's masochistic enjoyment. So relying on those who potentially know, wishing to participate to the enjoyment of this hoard, hoping that from the rich table of the leader would fall down some rituals of enjoyment. So accepting any ideological content is simply the consequence of this total surrendering. So this is tied to the last remark. Freud underlines quite evidently how in this revival of the horde, talking about the primary mass, the individual renounces to his way of being to satisfy the need to be in harmony with the others, obeying to the leader and his orders. The individual libido is originally activated by this fascination for the higher freedom, libidinal freedom of the leader. This is making the single structures vibrate. It's extended to the peers by fostering this peer-to-peer relation. So enjoying together is a prerequisite in the mass. We cannot renounce to participate to this ritual that requires abandoning one's condition. That's why Freud says, and I'm getting to my conclusion, that entering the mass means renouncing to the moral consciousness. This is a liberation by inhibitions to be entitled to be part of the ceremonial of the mass. So in this regard, the mass acts in two opposite directions compared to this civilization, as Freud would theorize at the end of the same decade. Accessing civilization needs a pulsional renunciation. It's the price to be paid to be accepted in the human scope. This renunciation then would create the discomfort that then is the title of this essay. So entering the mass requires to renounce to one's morality and promises the possibility to have free access to pulsional satisfaction that are condemned by the society. So belonging to a mass means treating this discomfort that historically and culturally underlies any kind of this form. So this regression, I think it's very interesting and promising, this kind of analysis. This would deserve an in-depth analysis, but for the sake of time, of course, I cannot go any longer. So thank you, Franco. I have a couple of remarks, and I would like to try and answer to some of your remarks. And so it's quite curious. I think that your reading shows a lack of confidence towards the mass. It's even more radical than Freud's thought. This lack of trust by Le Bon for the group is mitigated by leaving the possibility of a group functioning, a working group, who would say, that works well, that performs well. The second remark I wanted to ask is that I think that this reading that you are providing as regards enjoyment implies that the leader is somehow going beyond the law because he's not undergoing the law. So that from this point of view, I'm wondering, maybe it's not true, but I wanted to know if we want to object to what Franco said, that a man is part of a horde, as you said. We as no gregarious dimension because he is a member of the horde, but maybe I misunderstood. Anyway, this made me think La Màdera's fault. It's like as if Freud ignores that there is a long period of neoteny in which the human being learns society. So when this human being has been or is in this condition that Freud is proposing, I don't know if I'm clear enough. Anyway, I would like to ask Professor Magra, Luciano, and Franco if they want to animate this debate. And then those who want to submit questions, you can do it in the chat box. Professor Màdera. Yes, you have already mentioned one of the possible objections, of course. We cannot make a long debate on this issue of organized masses that Freud at a certain point says, I wanted to take these organized masses as a reference. So it's an important point. Of course, we might have clashing visions. My vision is probably different compared to the general psychoanalytic view. This depends also on my background. So, of course, I've been also analyzing the psychoanalytical implications, but from Freud, we have to take, first of all, the courage of new thoughts and also the courage of thinking with his own mind. Yes, of course, I agree on learning, social life, and sociability. This concept of cooperation that is quite different from what Freud discussed about this gregarious instinct. It's two very different things. Freud himself talked about sort of romance, scientific romance in Totem Taboo. So the concept of the horde was framed in this context, analyzing the analytical work and the fact that these elements can be interrelated. Of course, we do not have time enough to discuss about this, but there are two different ways of reasoning then unified in the human sciences, the concept of the social, the Marxian, Hegel, or Aristotle. So of course, we can operate at different levels, and there are different explanations. But I think it might be interesting regarding the concept of the masses, the concept of masses, to remind anthropologists who positively quotes Freud, but at the same time makes an extraordinary example for today's masses. De Martino is talking about these crowds clashing in Stockholm in 56, if I'm not mistaken. People apparently they have no reason. The reason is clashing, nihilism, and so on and so forth. So I think that this is an interesting phenomenon that is still present today. Bands or gangs where we can see these masses similar to hordes. Gangs who can be related to football or ideologies that specifically meet to hit each other. Violence for violence. To me, this is very interesting. With no scandal, because it means saying that a way to someone is fighting against the other. This nihilism of the other, this sense of annihilation, they say that something deep, we have reached our true ideology, which is this relations of forces that sometimes are faked behind financial reasons or economic reasons, but also these economic relations are relations of strength, of forces. Well, quickly, I really appreciated the concept expressed by Bracalenti. That's the objection on the issue of the family. Because to me, we have, of course, to have our own ideas and still stick to my idea. And we have to wonder why There are so many murders in families. Most majority are women. In Italy, put aside India or in European and US countries, Italy has almost the track record, the record in the number of women being killed. How can we explain this? The general mechanisms are not very well understood. But we have to try and explain with the fact that in Italy, compared to Sweden, Germany, France, the US, this happened more rapidly. That is, lagging behind led to the fact that when a sort of disruption started in the male, the change in the role of man, it was a rapid social development that led to this strong consequence. Pseudospeciation, yes, of course, we can say that. It is related to the patriarchal culture, which always stated that a woman, all in all, is something minor. So pseudospeciation, the actual species is man. This story is a long-lasting one.
Questo non c'entra niente con il discorso sulle masse, ma la
It has
formazione
nothing to do with the discourse on masses, but also the whole idea of the relationship with hysteria. Unfortunately, I don't, well, but can I say something? If you want to read the chaos, Il Caos degli Affetti, you will also find a reflection on the on Freud's and Jung's chauvinist attitude. Well, of course, the case of Sabina Spear is you know, a textbook case. I mean, that really shows a mentality where they really get to the limit. I mean, they're totally into that mentality, and we can also see it in other cases. Anyway, the interesting thing that connects, you know, pseudospeciation to the feminine gender is that in Wien, the Jew was the name to give to the clitoris. That is extraordinary because women have always had in our world this sort of link between those who had to be thrown away, so pseudospeciation, and also in Freud biographically, this is fundamental. You simply need to read. Here we have Sergio Benvenuto, Facchinelli, and others. Facchinelli started talking about Freud, talking about the offense that he did to the father made by an Aryan. So the theme, Jews, women, that is pseudospeciation once again. And I think that it plays a key role. Second, very brief remark on the crisis of the institution and so on. Okay, fine. But let us be careful because it has a Eurocentric vision of the thing. And maybe it also concerns the United States and Canada. Why? Is it really true that the institutions are in crisis the world over? Or isn't it a more specific problem? Because, I mean, you can tell me whatever you like, but we are not making a generalization. For the moment, is there a crisis of the institutions in China? No. I would also tell you, and the theory of leaders. I mean, let's take the Chinese history. How can you analyze from that standpoint? The most charismatic leader was Mao Zedong. Where was he 2 or 3 years after his death? And who won? The institution. And the institution built the charisma of someone who had no charisma at all. Xi Jinping, Deng Xiaoping before him. Who were they? And Deng Xiaoping had participated in the revolution, but he was not charismatic at all. So I don't think that this is relevant at all. And then if you find that, I mean, I don't really see this. Professor, I have to stop you to give the floor to Luciano, Franco, and then we would see if we have some questions that we will find on the chat. Luciano? No, I think that we should focus on the questions because I already spoke. So if there's someone who would like to ask questions, Franco would like to say something, or should we pass to the questions? Well, no, yeah, let's move to the questions. I simply wanted to say something with regards to what you asked, Raffaele, with regards to tautology. The leader also establishes the law after he becomes a leader. So I think my reasoning is, how can one become a boss, a leader? But that, I mean, that was debated, Kratos and Dia, how power, I mean, I understand your objection, but when you propose yourself as a leader, you also accept the fact that you, I mean, the institution versus the state of exception. Well, yeah, that is clear. But what I wanted to say was, I want to also reason, seeing what is happening and also studying what happened, how a leader is identified, how a leader is detected or spotted. So my reflection was that the leader bases his law, and he sees himself as an exception to his own law, relying on the fact that he was elected, he was chosen. So how can a human being place himself in that position? How can he be chosen? So I think that Freud's contribution in this is very important and not so much studied when he says that he has to have more freedom. I think that he's saying something that is more very, very important. I didn't have a lot of time, but I think that this is an important reflection to analyze in depth, because if we think about the current phenomena of masses, well, clearly that has its absolute consistency. But anyway, but as we have a question, Sergio, for instance, said, let me see, Sergio said that Lolli's right followers are attracted to the tour. So saying, so does it mean that the democratic peoples are savages? No, I think that we should make a distinction between masses and institutions. And when Freud talks about church and army, he talks about organized masses. When he talks about certain phenomena, he talks about disorganized masses, those who have not yet been absorbed. I do not know what Sergio said. No, sorry, I wanted to say something. But in fact, I was referring to the societies that Freud, Lacan, Jung, and others organized. I wasn't referring that they experienced, and not at the societies that came after that. So the description of the leader that you did, and which was very beautiful, and I shared that, also applies to those societies. So in a way, there is a sort of immorality, if you're right, and I think that you're right, that there is an immorality of psychoanalytical societies. If you're right, I mean, following your thought, well, I mean, there is something wrong in any psychoanalytical society. Yes, I remember that we talked about that in Bologna. And I also think that there is something true in what you said, but I also think that the institution tries to somehow regulate this origin, but the origin is absolutely that, in my view, but I think that it's Freud who says that. It's not only me believing that, but then, but he did not apply that to his own society. Was certainly, and the society was very repressive. Many people were expelled, starting from Jung. If you read Francois Rostang's book, well, that was a horde. Freud's psychoanalytical society was a horde, and he said that. And Rostang also reports Freud's sentences said to his colleagues, in which he himself said, "We are a horde. We're not a society. We ourselves are a horde." Now, allow me to summarize 3 questions. One is by Sergio said, following what Màdera says, we might say that the only non-human species is the enemy man. The hunter doesn't hate the prey, only man hates the other man. And therefore, and another question is, how can you decline pseudospeciation in the case of the discrimination of minors as a second league citizens, so adult-centrism? And then we also have a question. I do not really know who that is for, but mass and psychology doesn't take into consideration Wemmer's Vaterloh-Gesellschaft. I do not know who can answer. Well, I cannot answer, of course, so I will leave it to you. So Màdera, thank you for the 2 questions, and then whoever wants to take the floor. I mean, I understood one of the questions. Could you repeat the other question? The one on pseudospeciation, I think that is quite easy. I mean, the discrimination of minors. What minors? Minors are cheap labor, cheap commodities that can be bought with nothing. Where do they come from? You simply need to see where they come from geographically, culturally, socially, and you can clearly see that there is a speciation, and it worked against women, but let us also remember that it also worked. I mean, we have a good 100,000 years as of history as Sapiens Sapiens, and it worked until the 18th century. I mean, there were also prophets that somehow thought other things like Azoka. There is something in Buddhism, in Christianity, also in Paul, and so on. But I mean, we had to wait the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution even, to have the people's rights recognized. So you see, this is one of the mechanisms. Hon said was humiliation, violence, torture, killings, but then there is the belittling values, social oppression, the exclusion of rights. I cannot remember the other question. Is man, as man cures also other species without hating them, only men hate other men? That is my question. That is Sergio Benvenuto's question. It is not a question, it is a wonderful sentence. I mean, it is a very nice sentence. It is not a question. So you agree with that? It is, yes, a very nice aphorism because it shows the tragic nature of the whole issue. It is not simply the let's say organized way in which I described this. I apologize. As Bracalenti said, he said that many women are killed within families, and I think that he's highlighting the fact that in reality, the true enemy of men is the one that is closest to men. According to your theory, some human beings are seen as different, as non-human, but the reality is quite different, and Freud would totally be agree with this when he talked about narcissism, because the most terrible enemy is the closest person, is our neighbor, Like in Edgar Allan Poe, where the enemy, historically, I do not agree with this, and I think that I have a lot of evidence on this. I apologize. There is no comparison between the genocide of other tribes and what happens within one same tribe or one same people. And the Jews that they were Germans, they were German. Come on, they were Germans according to them and formally speaking, but if you read if you read anti-Semitism through the centuries, I mean, there were Germans for themselves and for intelligent, for smart Germans, but for the masses, they were not. Unfortunately, even Lutheranism, as you know, contributed to this. Sergio, Cristiana wants to take the floor. Cristiana. And then Waterloo's Gesellschaft, the question about Waterloo's Gesellschaft. I wanted to remind you that if there is a central level in the Freud's book, well, we have to say that it is Freud's interpretation of war, which is something totally new and unprecedented. Why war is possible? Because good fathers are authorized to take a rifle and to go to war. And this was something that was quite revolutionary. In fact, when Freud published the book, he said, asked themselves how was it possible to publish this text, because it was so unprecedented. And then another thing with regards to homicides within the families, especially women killed within the families by other family members, we should also talk about enjoyment, but from the female standpoint, but we do not have time. Romano Tradera also talked about Sabina Sperline, and I think that this woman, but for both Freud and Jung, in this terrible triangle, represented female enjoyment. She really embodied it. I do not know if you know the story of that woman and also the story of what she wrote, but it is such a huge theme that I will stop here. Also, with regards to that, Freud, sexuality, and so on, I would like to read a post by Salvatore Zipparri saying, with regards to the connection between Jews and female, we need to recall Otto Veninger's essay of 1903. Veninger thought that his ideas were stolen by Freud. Now, since we have less than 10 minutes, because otherwise our interpreters will need to be paid for their overtime. I promised, as we are in this very violent climate and environment that we talked about today with pseudospeciation and so on and so forth, I don't want to generate any violence. Who would like to answer the last question? I would like to say something about that. Feder was one. Feder was one of those people who was very close to social democracy. Now, could you please repeat? He was close to German socialists, and nobody liked that. Nobody appreciated that, as Adler was not appreciated, for instance. Freud was not appreciated. They said, well, we're doctors, we're physicians, we're not politicians. And also Jung had already been expelled. He was a conservative, a liberal.
testa di fronte a qualsiasi cosa che alludesse alla sinistra.
So he didn't appreciate anything that actually had to do with left parties. Well, it was just a joke, but I think that you were quite serious. I've also found a sudden note. Now, the last meeting, I said that Freud was surprised when civil societies can solve their conflicts through war. And I said that these civil societies were bearers of values. I mean, they exported democracy throughout the world. And there was, for instance, the killing of 10 million Congolese on the part of Leopold II for the exploitation of caoutchouc. And Stefano Guerra even said that Conan Doyle wrote articles on this tragedy. All right, so I would like to thank you, and I think that we can close here. I thank them for their work. The next meeting will be on the 12th of April with Fernando Castillon and Benjamin Fong and Sergio Benvenuto. Also, I would like to remind you that our session on the 26th for the presentation of the magazine Dromo. At that meeting, we will not have a simultaneous translation. We apologize for that. While for the meeting of the 9th of April, not of the 12th of April, we will have the translation. So I wish to thank Professor Màdera, Franco Lolli, Luciano De Fiore. Thank you. And we will see you soon for the next initiative. Thank you.
Grazie, buonasera.